So, welcome to Florence. Yes, that Florence. No, not the girl from your math class who always smelled like lavender and disappointment. The Florence in Italy. The one with the cathedrals, the art, the Renaissance, and enough drama to rival a Kardashian family dinner. You're about to enter the birthplace of an era that dragged Europe out of its medieval slump, like a depressed student getting out of bed for pizza. We're going to walk through the cobbled streets, not literally, because this is an audio thing and I don't have that kind of budget, but imagine it. You, me, and 600 years of political intrigue, genius artists, and lots of naked statues. Before Florence was Florence, the shining jewel of the Renaissance, the land of art, fashion, and people who can make bread taste like it descended from heaven itself. It was a swamp. No, really, a swamp. Picture this: muddy plains, flood-prone lowlands, and a charming mix of stagnant waters, and mosquito swarms the size of small birds. The kind of place where you wouldn't just catch malaria, you'd get the deluxe package, complete with the dysentery and the occasional stabbing. And oh, the stabbings. This was not the romantic Florence you see in glossary travel brochures. This was the Florence where most conflicts were solved with pointy sticks, and neighbor disputes were usually meant 3 families dead and a goat missing. The goat was most often the most valuable thing involved. Now, officially, Florence, or Florentia, as the Romans christened it, was founded in 59 BCE. Why? Well, the Romans were busy conquering everything in sight, and apparently they looked at this soggy patch of mosquito paradise and thought, yes, this is where we'll build our next city, which we're going to name after ourselves. Because the Romans had a rule: if you've already built 30 cities, you need at least 30 more with similar names, just to confuse historians later. At first, Florentia wasn't much more than a glorified military camp. It had straight roads, because Romans loved a good right angle, a few stone buildings, and a whole lot of ambition it hadn't earned yet. Think of it as that one kid in school who insists they're going to be famous, but currently works at their uncle's fish stall. A couple of centuries rolled by and things got slightly better. The mud was still there. The mosquitoes were still auditioning for lead roles in a horror movie. But trade began to trickle in, and here's where Florence began to develop its first real personality. It upgraded from goats to wool. Yes, wool. Now, I know that doesn't sound exciting, but trust me, wool was the medieval version of Bitcoin. You could make a fortune with it if you knew what you were doing. Or you could die horribly if you crossed the wrong merchant family, which, spoiler alert, is going to be a theme in Florence's history. Getting rich and then dying violently, over and over. The city became a stopover for traders, soldiers, and anyone with goods to sell, which unfortunately also meant anyone with goods to steal. If you think Florence's later political assassinations were dramatic, you should have seen the negotiations over a shipment of fine cloth in the early days. These people could make a pirate crew look like a quilting club. And before you ask, when does this all get artsy and revolutionary? When do we see Michelangelo, Botticelli, and Leonardo da Vinci strolling around in tights? Not yet. Oh no, we're still in the warm-up phase. The part where Florence is basically a rough, slightly damp proto-city, whose favorite hobbies are trading, plotting, and killing each other. The bloodbath continues for a while longer before the art shows up. And honestly, that's exactly what makes the Renaissance later on so impressive. Because before Florence was covered in marble statues, frescoes, and gilded chapels, it was covered in mud, blood, and an alarming number of suspiciously shallow graves. But don't worry, we'll get to the glory. First, we have to wade through the swamp. literally. Chapter 2. The Medici, Florence's favorite crime family. The Medici, the Renaissance equivalent of a Netflix mafia drama, except with more velvet, more gold leaf, and far fewer FBI raids. If The Godfather had been filmed in Florence circa 1450, it would have been 3 hours of slow walking through marbled halls, hushed conversations about interest rates, and the occasional discreet poisoning over wine. They started small, humble bankers, and not even flashy bankers at first. Think respectable little money counters who made loans, held up deposits, and quietly got rich while other people were busy stabbing each other in alleyways. But the Medici had a talent, a superpower really, for 2 things: making money, multiply, and making friends in very high places. And when I say friends, I mean the kind who could change the laws for you, annul your enemies' marriages, and maybe launch a war on your behalf. Because in Renaissance Florence, banking wasn't just about gold coins, it was about influence. The Medici understood that better than anyone, and boy did they cash in. Pretty soon, the family's reach went far beyond the local branch. They weren't just keeping the books for merchants anymore. They were handling the finances of kings, dukes, and even the Pope. Imagine if your local bank manager suddenly decided to fund Michelangelo's career, bribe half the city council, and then crown their cousin as Pope. That was peak Medici energy. And yes, they did exactly that more than once. They produced 4 popes, all of whom had the moral flexibility of a yoga instructor, and a string of dukes, cardinals, and queens. They married into royal houses. They became the royal houses. The Medici name was basically a Renaissance cheat code. Then there was Lorenzo de' Medici, better known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. Yes, that was his actual title, because subtlety was not invented back then. Lorenzo wasn't just rich. He was rich in that dangerous, world-shaping way. He turned Florence into what can only be described as Renaissance Disneyland. The streets filled with art, music, festivals, and enough political intrigue to keep gossamongers busy for decades. Under his watch, the Medici bankrolled a who's who of art. Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, you name it. They didn't just collect art, they manufactured an entire cultural explosion. The Renaissance might have still happened without them, but it would have been slower, poorer, and definitely less sparkly. Of course, that kind of power didn't come from just smiling and shaking hands. The Medici were masters of Renaissance power move. Bribery when it worked, poison when it didn't, and strategic marriages everywhere in between. You didn't cross the Medici, not unless you wanted to wake up in a shallow grave, or worse, exiled to some mosquito-ridden backwater where no one would ever hear from you again. And yet, here's the thing. Florence forgave them. Why? Because they gave the city so much beauty, innovation, and culture that the political crimes almost felt like a fair trade. Sure, they manipulated half of Europe, but they also gave us the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And a lot of other stuff. I mean, priorities, right? So yes, they were power-hungry, occasionally murderers, and never afraid to rewrite the rules to suit themselves. But without them, Florence might still be that muddy little wool town from Chapter 1. The Medici didn't just rule Florence, they built the Florence we remember. And just like any good crime family, they made sure their name would never be forgotten. Chapter 3. Art that changed everything and made everyone naked. Florence is where art went from let's paint Jesus in a flat gold blob to let's carve a 17-foot tall nude guy, put him in the middle of the plaza, and hope nobody complains about the proportions. This was not just a glow up, it was a revolution, a cultural jailbreak, so to speak. Suddenly, artists weren't just making holy icons to hang in churches, they were experimenting with perspective, anatomy, movement, and apparently the public's comfort level with full frontal nudity. Enter the dream team. Donatello, not the turtle, Botticelli, Michelangelo, and of course, Leonardo da Vinci. A man so talented, it's borderline insulting to the rest of humanity. Leonardo painted, sculpted, engineered, designed weapons, dissected corpses, and wrote in a secret mirrored handwriting. He was basically the Renaissance equivalent of that annoying friend who's good at everything without trying. These weren't just artists, they were rock stars with chisels and paintbrushes. They painted like their reputations depended on it, which they did. Florence was the competitor pressure cooker. Your patrons' praise could make you immortal. Their disapproval could ruin you faster than you could say, oops, I made that Virgin Mary look cross-eyed. And speaking of patrons, here's where the Medici and their wealthy friends re-enter the chat. These were not casual art collectors. They were the Renaissance version of venture capitalists. Except instead of investing in tech startups, they were throwing gold at anyone who could make God look fabulous on canvas. In return, they expected absolute masterpieces and absolute loyalty. This loyalty wasn't just a handshake agreement. If your patron got into political trouble, so did you. If they went to war, you'd better start painting banners, designing fortifications, or sculpting something that made them look heroic. Art was currency, propaganda, and religious devotion rolled into one, and Florence was minting it by the ton. Let's not pretend it was all glamorous, though. Take Michelangelo. The man painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling lying on scaffolding for years, inhaling enough paint fumes to knock out a mule, and developing a spine shaped like a question mark. Imagine pouring your heart into a masterpiece for 4 years straight, only to have the Pope stroll in, squint, and say, "Can you make that Last Judgment a little less naked?" Florentine art didn't just change the way people painted and sculpted, it changed the way they thought. It blurred the lines between the divine and human. Saints suddenly had cheekbones. Biblical scenes were full-on realistic landscapes and dramatic tension. And for some reasons, Renaissance babies always looked like middle-aged tax accountants with tiny judgmental faces. No one knows why. But that was the magic of it. Florence made art personal, dangerous, and breathtakingly alive. It was about beauty, yes, but also about power, ego, and the audacity to carve perfection out of stone and hang it in the town square. And maybe, just maybe, it was about seeing how much marble nude the city could handle before the church sent a strongly worded letter. Chapter 4. Brains, Books, and Machiavelli. Renaissance literally means rebirth, and in Florence, that rebirth looked a lot like the city collectively waking up one morning, looking around and saying, "You know what? We don't want to live in the Dark Age anymore. Maybe mud, plague, and superstition aren't the height of civilization." So they started reading, and not just light bedtime stories. They were dusting off ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts, poring over Aristotle and Plato like they were binge-watching a new Netflix series. This is where humanism started to take root. The wild idea that maybe humans could think for themselves, question authority, and decide their own destinies without needing every single decision rubber-stamped by the church. Of course, questioning authority was a dangerous hobby back then. You could get praised as a genius one week and burned as a heretic the next. It was basically intellectual roulette, but Florence thrived on it. Philosophers, writers, and scholars were everywhere, cramming into libraries, debating over wine, and scribbling treatises that would either change the world or get them killed. And right in the middle of this intellectual storm was Niccolo Machiavelli, the man who turned political cynicism into an art form. If the Renaissance was a party, Machiavelli was the guy in the corner sipping wine, observing everyone, and quietly thinking, "These idiots have no idea what they're doing." He worked for the Florentine Republic as a diplomat and official, rubbing elbows with popes, princes, and generals. His job was to navigate Florence through wars, alliances, and the occasional "oops, we've been invaded" moment. And for a while he did it well. But in Renaissance politics, for a while is the best you can hope for. Eventually, things went south. The Medici, yes, those Medicis, got back into power, and Machiavelli ended up on the wrong side of the political chessboard, which in Florence meant you didn't just get fired. You got arrested, tortured, and exiled to your country estate. And this is where Machiavelli became truly iconic. Instead of sulking, he sat down and wrote The Prince, his razor-sharp guide to political survival. It was short, brutal, and incredibly practical. His main thesis: if you want to stay in power, stop being nice. Do whatever it takes. Lie, manipulate, intimidate, kill if you have to. And for the love of God, don't rely on people liking you. They're fickle. Fear is much more reliable. It wasn't a moral manifesto. It was a manual for getting things done in the messy, backstabbing reality of Renaissance politics. And it still feels weirdly relevant today. Of course, people at its time had mixed feelings. Some saw him as a genius truth-teller. Others thought he was Satan's personal ghostwriter. But Machiavelli didn't care. He wrote out of pure spite. Revenge literature at its finest. If he couldn't be in the game, he'd write the rulebook. And that's why he's my favorite. Because honestly, few things in history are as relatable as being wronged by your boss, retreating to your desk, and producing something so biting, so brilliant that people will be quoting it 500 years later. Florence may have been a city of art and rebirth, but Machiavelli made it sure it also had teeth. So, thanks Machiavelli! Chapter 5. Florence's Architecture, Big Domes, Bigger Egos. Florence's skyline is a stone and marble shout for attention. Domes, towers, and churches loom over the city like they're all competing in a centuries-long beauty pageant. Each screaming, "Look at me, I'm the most divine." And honestly, they kind of were, just without the evening gown portion. The crown jewel of this architectural ego contest, Brunelleschi's dome on the Santa Maria del Fiore, or simply the Duomo. This wasn't just a dome. This was the engineer equivalent of a mic drop. When Florence decided it needed the biggest, most impressive cathedral in Christendom, they ran into one tiny problem. No one had a clue how to build a dome that big without the whole thing collapsing like a badly made souffle. There were no cranes that could reach that high, no scaffolding strong enough, and most importantly, no one willing to risk their career and possibly their neck trying. Enter Filippo Brunelleschi, goldsmith, sculptor, architect, and all around I'm smarter than you kind of guy. He looked at this impossible project, cracked his knuckles, and said, "I've got this." How? He didn't exactly explain. No instruction manual, no detailed blueprints, just pure, unshakable confidence and a refusal to share his methods with anyone, probably to make sure no one stole his thunder. The result? A massive brick and mortar masterpiece that has stood for nearly 600 years without collapsing. And remember, this was done with no modern machinery, no computer models, and certainly no YouTube tutorials. Just an army of workers, an absurd amount of ingenuity, and the sheer audacity to think I can do what the ancient Romans did, but better. And here's the thing. They didn't just build to worship God. Oh no, they built to flex. Every tower, every chapel, every carved facade was part holy devotion, part in your face to rival cities like Siena and Pisa. It was as much about civic pride as it was about saving your soul. Even their chapels were over the top. You walk in expecting a quiet little space for prayers, and instead you get marble floors, frescoed ceilings, gilded art altars, and enough stained glass to make you feel underdressed. And then there were the tombs. Florentine tombs weren't just graves, they were monuments to ego. If you were anybody in Renaissance Florence, your eternal resting place had to be carved from the finest marble, preferably by Michelangelo himself. Bonus points if it included heroic statues of you looking deep in thought or holding a sword you probably never used. And if Michelangelo didn't sculpt your tomb, did you even die in Florence, or were you just quietly buried with the peasants, doomed to be forgotten in the footnotes of history? From Duomo to Palazzo Vecchio, Florence's architecture is a love letter to beauty, ambition, and the human need to be remembered forever. And let's be real. Every time you walk past Brunelleschi's dome, you can almost hear it whisper, "Nice try, modern world, you're still not as good as me." Well, not exactly, but poeticism, people like that, somehow. Chapter 6. Fire, Fanatics, and the Fall from Grace. Every great party has to end, and Florence's Renaissance, this glittering, velvet-draped, marble-polished, art-funded, century-long bash was no exception. And like most parties, it didn't end quietly. It ended because someone showed up and started screaming about sin. Enter Girolamo Savonarola. Why are there so many O's and A's in this person's name? Whatever. A Dominican friar with the energy of a fire and brimstone TikTok preacher and the charisma of someone who could sell ice to a Venetian merchant. He didn't just think Florence was morally corrupt, he was obsessed with the idea. Gold jewelry, sinful. Gold jewelry, sinful. Flattering clothes, sinful. Paintings of naked people, double sinful. Basically, if it was fun, beautiful, or mildly enjoyable, Savonarola thought it was a one-way ticket to eternal damnation. And people listened. Oh, did they listen. This man could pack a piazza just by threatening everyone with hellfire. He thundered from pulpits, whipped up the crowds, and before long, he wasn't just a preacher, he was Florence's de facto ruler. The city went from Renaissance playground to Puritan boot camp practically overnight. Then came the bonfire of vanities. Imagine the world's most depressing yard sale, except instead of selling things, you burned them. Under Savonarola's orders, Florentines gathered their sinful possessions, books, paintings, mirrors, cosmetic, musical instruments, fine clothes, anything that hinted at vanity or pleasure, and piled them high in the public square before setting them ablaze. The city that had spent decades nurturing beauty, creativity, and art suddenly decided beauty was the enemy. Priceless works disappeared in smoke, rare manuscripts gone, musical instrument destroyed. It was like if Instagram got banned, and instead of complaining, people lined up to delete every photo they'd ever taken. And because the Renaissance loved a good plot twist, the story doesn't end there. You see, Florence's love affair with Savonarola didn't last forever. Turns out ruling by guilt and fear works until people get tired of feeling fear and guilt. Eventually, the city turned on him. His enemies accused him of heresy, corruption, and, of course, the catch of all crime of making too many powerful people angry. The irony? They burned him too, right in the same public square where he'd held his bonfires. You could almost hear the universe laughing. Florence's Renaissance didn't vanish entirely after Savonarola, but his reign marked a turning point. The city's wild, unrestrained golden age gave way to something more cautious, more politically tangled, and, let's be honest, a little less fun. But in true Florentine fashion, even the downfall was dramatic, poetic, and perfectly staged. Because the Renaissance had a favorite hobby, aside from marble nudity, political scheming, and flexing with giant domes. It was irony. And the A's and O's in this guy's name. Savonarola's fiery rise and fall might just be its best work. Today, Florence is full of tourists pretending to know art, overpriced gelato, and college students finding themselves. But underneath the selfie sticks and souvenir stands is a city that once changed the world. It dragged Europe out of medieval darkness with paint, philosophy, and scandal. It gave us beauty and betrayal, domes and daggers, power and poetry. And even now, if you walk those streets with your eyes open and your phone off, you can still feel it breathing. Well, not really, but I was trying to be poetic. Bye!